For scholars, close reading is a mode of analysis, one of many possible modes, many of which can be used in conjunction with one another, that moves a reader beyond comprehension of the text to interpretation of the text. I like to think of close reading as a process with two major steps, plus a bonus step if you're using the process to write a paper. The first step is to read and observe. These observations would include the specific textual evidence the Common Core standards mention, concrete things you can point to in the text. Direct observations are pretty much the defining element that make close reading close reading. Usually, you read the text multiple times in order to make note of as many observations as possible. And speaking of making notes, close reading usually involves some form of note-taking.
Hello, everyone. Were you able to hear the native speaker's voice clearly today? In American elementary schools, students learn what close reading is. This is something that can be helpful for anyone. So let's also learn together what close reading means, step by step, through the native speaker's voice.
For scholars, close reading is a mode of analysis, one of many possible modes, many of which can be used in conjunction with one another, that moves a reader beyond comprehension of the text to interpretation of the text.
So the sentence begins with, for scholars, close reading is a mode of analysis. That's just saying when we talk about scholars, people who study texts really seriously, they see close reading as one method of analysis. Then it continues, one of many possible modes, many of which can be used in conjunction with one another. Here the speaker is reminding us that there isn't only one way to analyze a text. There are lots of approaches, and often scholars use them together, not just separately. Finally, the sentence says that close reading moves a reader beyond comprehension of the text to interpretation of the text. And this is the heart of it. Comprehension means you understand the words, you know what the sentences are saying, but interpretation goes deeper. It means you start to ask, what does this text really mean? Why does it matter? What is the author trying to do? So put all of this together, and the big idea is clear. Close reading is about going further than just understanding the words. It's about stepping into the deeper meaning of the text.
I like to think of close reading as a process with two major steps, plus a bonus step if you're using the process to write a paper.
Here, the idea is very simple. The speaker isn't saying there is only one official definition, but personally, she liked to imagine close reading as a process you can follow. That process has two major steps. So it feels structured, like a little guide you can follow one step at a time. And then there's a bonus step. That's an extra step you might take if your goal is to write a paper, not just to practice reading. So in short, the important point is close reading can be seen as a step-by-step process, two major steps, and maybe a bonus step if you're writing. It's kind of like cooking with two main ingredients and then adding a special spice if you want extra flavor.
The first step is to read and observe. These observations would include the specific textual evidence the Common Core standards mention, concrete things you can point to in the text.
The sentence says, the first step is to read and observe. So before anything else, you slow down and really pay attention to the text. Read and observe means you're not just letting the words pass by. You're noticing details, patterns, and little things that stand out. Then it adds, these observations would include the specific textual evidence the Common Core standards mention. Now, the Common Core standards are just a set of national guidelines used in U.S. schools. They tell teachers and students what kinds of skills are important, like finding evidence directly in a text. So here the point is that your observations should be about concrete things in the text, details you can actually point to and say, here it is. That's the key, specific textual evidence. It's not just a vague feeling or a guess. It's something real in the text, like a word choice, a phrase, or a repetition that you can show as proof. It's a little like being a detective at a crime scene. You don't just say, I feel something happened here. You actually collect the clues you can point to.
Direct observations are pretty much the defining element that make close reading close reading. Usually, you read the text multiple times in order to make note of as many observations as possible.
The sentence says, direct observations are pretty much the defining element that makes close reading close reading. In other words, the whole point of close reading is this. You don't just think in general terms. You actually look closely and collect direct observations. That's what gives close reading its name and its power. Then it continues. Usually, you read the text multiple times in order to make note of as many observations as possible. This means one reading is not enough. Each time you go back, you notice something new, maybe a word you missed or a pattern you didn't see before. And by reading multiple times, you build up a strong list of observations that you can later interpret. It's like looking at a painting. The first time you see the big picture, but the second and third time, you notice the colors, the brushstrokes, and the little details that bring it to life.
And speaking of making notes, close reading usually involves some form of note-taking.
The sentence begins, and speaking of making notes, close reading usually involves some form of note-taking. So here the speaker is connecting it back to the idea of observations. When you do close reading, you don't just keep those ideas in your head, you write them down. That note-taking could be simple, like writing in the margins of the book, or more organized, like keeping a list in a notebook or on your computer. The important thing is that you capture your observations somewhere so you can come back to them when you're ready to interpret the text more deeply. All right, we've explored the whole native audio together. Now let's play it one more time, just to hear it with fresh ears. And after that, we'll have some fun looking at how these expressions like close reading or observations can actually pop up in our everyday lives. Because learning English isn't just about understanding the text, it's about making the words part of your own story.
For scholars, close reading is a mode of analysis, one of many possible modes, many of which can be used in conjunction with one another, that moves a reader beyond comprehension of the text to interpretation of the text. I like to think of close reading as a process with 2 major steps, plus a bonus step if you're using the process to write a paper. The first step is to read and observe. These observations would include the specific textual evidence the Common Core standards mention, concrete things you can point to in the text. Direct observations are pretty much the defining element that make close reading close reading. Usually, you read the text multiple times in order to make note of as many observations as possible. And speaking of making notes, close reading usually involves some form of note-taking.
All right, you've just listened to the native audio one more time. Now let's take what we learned and see how these expressions can actually work in everyday life. I picked 3 of the most useful ones for us to practice: close reading, in conjunction with one another, and comprehension of the text. Let's make them real with some fun examples. First up, close reading. Of course, this is an academic term, but we can borrow it for daily life. For example, you could say, I did a close reading of the contract before signing it just to be safe. Another way to use it is, sometimes a close reading of someone's face tells you more than their words. Next, let's try in conjunction with one another. That's a fancy way to say together or combined. So you might say, the app works best in conjunction with one another when you connect it to your smartwatch. In another situation, we planned the birthday party in conjunction with one another, and it turned out amazing. Or even, exercise and good sleep when used in conjunction with one another really boost your mood. And finally, let's look at comprehension of the text. This is about basic understanding. So let's make it practical. My comprehension of the text improved a lot after reading it slowly twice. Another good example is, in book club, we focus first on comprehension of the text before sharing our opinions. And one more, her comprehension of the text was so good that she could explain it to everyone else in simple words. So there you go. 3 key expressions, each with examples you can imagine using in daily situations. Remember, the goal is not only to understand these phrases, but to make them part of your own English toolbox. All right, that's a wrap for today. Great job sticking with me all the way through. You didn't just understand the text, you also learned how to bring these expressions into real life. Keep listening, keep practicing, and you'll be surprised how naturally these words start to show up in your own conversations. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next practice.